Hello friends, my name is AJ and welcome back to another video. If you noticed the last video, I talked about the best programming languages for students and beginners to learn in 2020. Well, in this video, I'm going to go over the worst programming languages to learn in 2020 for students and just kind of talk about maybe some of the languages you may want to avoid and instead choose something a little bit better. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright everyone, so the languages that I'm going to be going over today, these are 5 languages and they're not going to be in any specific order. These are just the ones, again, that I think maybe are best to avoid and maybe try something else instead as a beginner or as a student. So we're going to be starting off with number 5 in this list. Again, remember, this is the numbering order doesn't necessarily mean that it's any better or any worse. But we're going to be starting with the Julia language. And Julia is a data science language similar to something like R, and also similar to Python with certain packages. Now the thing is that Julia is actually used by a smaller percentage of people than something like Python or R, and generally the Python and R languages outclass Julia in many different ways, which is why I wanted to put it on this list, because if you are interested, for example, in data science related things or data in general, or you're thinking about that, either some classes you want to take on it, or maybe even as a career choice, as a student, then that language may not be the best language for you to learn in the beginning, or as a student, perhaps maybe you would want to spend more time perfecting Python and maybe learning R. Those two languages are going to be very helpful for you when working with data, and something like Julia may not be as prevalent, and in general, just using R and Python are going to be much better and much faster for you to use. Now, that doesn't mean that Julia is completely useless. There are a lot of people who do use it for specific niche things, but just in general, more people use Python and R, and more people are happier using the vast amount of packages for Python and then the just general usability and functionality for R. Alright everybody, next up on the list, another language that I recommend for people to maybe avoid as a student or beginner is going to be the Ruby language. Now, Ruby in general is actually not necessarily declining, and it's not necessarily, a dying language. A lot of people still use Ruby, and it's so probably out of this list, it's probably the best option out of these worst option, if you want to say it that way, out of the options that I am putting on this list. Now the thing is that Ruby is used for things such as web development and multi-purpose scripting. So it is, in that sense, it's very similar to a language like Python, and that is where kind of the main issue lies here, is that Python generally outclasses Ruby for a lot of the things. And depending on usage, some people will prefer Ruby, some people will prefer Python, but due to Python's gaining popularity and Ruby is kind of just stagnant, Python is definitely going to be a much better language to focus your time on than something like Ruby. Now, it does not mean, of course, that Ruby is, because they just did have a major update, and Ruby is still used by a lot of people, both Ruby and then Ruby on Rails, which is the web version. A lot of people use these languages still. However, as maybe a beginner or a student in this particular, in this year, 2020 and beyond, learning something like Python will be much more useful for you. It's generally better syntax, a little bit easier to kind of write and learn as a scripting language than something like Ruby. Again, as I was saying, this does not mean that Ruby is in any way bad per se compared to some of the other languages on this list, but it is definitely probably recommended to learn something like Python for those multi-purpose scripting needs, especially due to Python's surging popularity and just its general, it's getting more and more support and more different packages and extensions to pretty much do anything that you want in the language. And since there are so many people learning it, there's so many resources also with Python that are more up to date, and there's a lot of activity around it. So if you have a question, if you want to kind of learn more, there's a lot of people who are wanting to learn it as well with you, and you're going to be able to maybe collaborate with more people on the language as well as get more questions answered. Alright everybody, for the third item in my list, again remember this is not necessarily in any specific order, but the next language is going to be a language that is on the decline, and this one is the Perl language. Now, some people may or may not have even heard of the language, but Perl has been used for web development, database management, and GUI, user interface in the past. And Perl in general is on the decline. There are less and less people getting interested in Perl, less and less people using Perl, and more people switching to other different types of languages. Perl in general has a much more complicated syntax, and a lot of people just would rather use another language for their needs. For example, web development, Python, JavaScript, there are so many different languages, even PHP to an extent if you want to use that. Those languages are significantly better for web development kind of in 2020 and beyond, and so many people are using those languages that Perl is just generally on the decline. In terms of database management, also, there are multiple other languages these days which are significantly better for it, and Perl may have some niche uses even now. However, in general, more people are going to be switching to different types of languages. So as a student or as a beginner, it's probably not going to be worthwhile to learn a language such as Perl. Alright everybody, now I want to get on to the second to last item on the list, which is actually part of the thing that I have made some videos relating. And this is a programming language used to make iOS applications as well as applications within the Apple ecosystem. And the language that I'm talking about, if you are familiar with that, is Objective-C. Objective-C was created by Apple almost well over many decades ago and was kind of the main go-to language that Apple used to create iOS applications back in the day. Now, this language has had a massive use case because if you can imagine that just a few years ago, all the apps on the App Store, they were mostly all powered by Objective-C. But recently, and I say recently relatively because it has been a few years now, but Apple has come up with a much better programming language for iOS development called Swift. And if you actually watch the video where I talked about the best programming languages to learn, Swift is actually on there. Swift is a language which is much simpler, much easier syntax, and much more developing than something like Objective-C. Objective-C, especially after Swift's release, because Swift just became so popular out of the box, and Apple was pretty much discontinuing Objective-C and starting to move a lot of their focus, and almost all of their focus, on Swift. If you've seen recently, we've had 5 versions of Swift, from all the way to Swift 5, and in addition, they've added some really new things every year, such as recently they came out with Swift UI, which is a massive overhaul to how you make user interface using Swift. And just in general, Apple is really focusing on the Swift programming language, and in general, it is pretty much killing Objective-C. Swift pretty much outclasses Objective-C in almost every way. Now the thing is that because there are a lot of apps in the past were based on Objective-C greatly, there are still many apps that are actually built in Objective-C, some of the older, more established applications. And those companies may be still using Objective-C developers in kind of managing those applications. However, from what I can see and what a lot of people have been saying about, their company or their apps recently, in the last few years, last few months, a lot of people are beginning to switch over from Objective-C to Swift. And it may not have already happened, it may be in the process of happening, but in general, you're going to see many apps. Already there have been many apps that have switched over to Swift, in fact, a very good portion of them, but you'll see even more over the next few months, next few years, switching over to Swift, simply because Objective-C is a dying language and Swift is the future, as Apple themselves have been saying. So in general, a lot of people, sooner rather than later, are going to be switching from Objective-C to Swift if they haven't already. And of course, this is for native development. The people who are doing cross-platform development are using maybe something like React Native with JavaScript, or maybe they're going to be using the new Flutter by Google. There are multiple other different technologies that people use for cross-platform development, where you write the same code and it works on both Android and iOS. However, the code that is native or specific to iOS, that is going to be generally increasingly done in the Swift programming language. The Swift programming language, I've actually made a few videos on it in general, but it is a very good language, and in general, if you're even thinking about doing anything iOS development related, I definitely recommend learning Swift. There's almost no reason at this point why you should learn Objective-C instead of Swift, and definitely if you're a student or a beginner who are interested in this, I definitely recommend learning Swift first at this point, just because again there are so many resources, people are excited, a lot of people are learning it, and more people are leaving Objective-C than are actually going into it. So I definitely recommend, if you are interested in this kind of stuff with building iOS apps, I'm very interested in this. I've spent a lot of time on the Swift language. If you're interested also, then I definitely recommend using Swift rather than Objective-C. Alright everyone, that brings me to the last item on the worst programming languages list. And the language that I'm going to be talking about as the last item on this list is going to be Visual Basic. According to the Stack Overflow Developer Survey of 2020, Visual Basic is the #1 most dreaded programming language this year among developers. So that automatically says a lot. But generally, Visual Basic in the past has been used for Windows desktop applications as well as Microsoft, for example, Microsoft Excel macros, to be able to work with data and then output something kind of within the Microsoft Excel environment. In general, Visual Basic is a dying language for things like desktop applications. People are using C#, they're using Java, they may even be using Python. They're going to be using other things. They're not going to be generally using Visual Basic. There have been less and less Visual Basic developers, and majority of those people are going to be moving to more popular languages of the time, such as Java, such as Python, such as all of these different things, the C# language. And in terms of the actual data work, in terms of the Microsoft Excel macros, for example, there are just so many other programming languages which are significantly better in literally every way. For example, the Python paired with packages such as pandas are pretty much faster, lighter, and more efficient in every single way than a Visual Basic based macro in Excel. There is pretty much no comparison between the two in terms of the speed, because in one you're working with a script, the other you're working with the already clunkier software, Microsoft Excel, and then you're having to work within it. So in general, Visual Basic is not going to be as prevalent anymore. First of all, it has been declining over time, but it is definitely in that category out of the languages that I've talked about in this video, in the dying category. Of course, the languages such as Julia per se and also Ruby, those are not dying languages, but the other three that I talked about, Perl, Objective-C, and now Visual Basic, these are in the languages that are in extreme decline. And the other thing, as I was saying, is that Visual Basic is just outclassed by pretty much any other programming languages, or the many other programming languages that are becoming popular, and it is pretty much going to become obsolete very quickly, if not already. So as a student, if for whatever reason you were thinking about learning Visual Basic, I definitely recommend, especially if you were learning Visual Basic for something like Excel work, I definitely recommend learning something like R or Python instead. That is going to serve you much, much better just in pretty much every way. And not to mention, you can use it then on both a Mac and on a PC and on Linux-based distributions. When you're working with Visual Basic, you're mainly on the Windows side, the Windows platform. And then if you're working on something like Windows desktop applications, I definitely recommend other types of languages, such as C#, maybe even Java, to achieve the same purpose. Not only is it greater used, it's going to be just generally easier to create. There are going to be more resources, more up-to-date resources, and a lot of people are going to be preferring those languages these days than something like Visual Basic. Alright everyone, that concludes the list of some of the programming languages that you may want to avoid when maybe trying out a new language or even learning programming as a beginner or as a student. If you have any questions or any comments on any of the different things that I talked about in this video, definitely leave them in the comment section below, and I would love to talk to you and also answer any questions that you may have. If you liked the video, feel free to like and subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.